The Making of the Twins, Post-War London. To understand the Kray twins, one must first understand the world that created them. Reginald and Ronald Kray were born on October 24, 1933, in Hoxton, East London. They were the youngest sons of Charles David Kray and Violet Lee. Their environment was the crowded, working-class streets of the East End. This area had been heavily bombed during the Blitz, leaving a landscape of rubble and resilience. Poverty was widespread, and opportunities for legitimate success were scarce. In such an environment, strength and street smarts were valued above all else. The Kray family was part of a large community with deep local roots. Their grandfather, Jimmy Lee, was a well-known local character and a bare-knuckle fighter. This connection to fighting and local notoriety was part of their inheritance. From a very young age, the twins were exceptionally close. They developed their own private language and an almost telepathic bond. This intense connection would become the foundation of their criminal partnership. Their childhood was not easy, and they were drawn to trouble from an early age. They attended Woodclose School in Bethnal Green, but their education was frequently interrupted. Their real education was happening on the streets, not in the classroom. They joined a local gang known as the Bishops, which was led by their older brother, Charlie. This was their introduction to organized violence and petty crime. The culture of the East End at this time was one of tight-knit communities. There was a strong distrust of authority, particularly the police. Loyalty to your family, your street, and your gang was paramount. This insular world would later help protect the Krays from prosecution for years. The twins also showed an early talent for boxing. Under the guidance of their grandfather and local trainers, they began to compete. By the age of 16, they were both accomplished amateur boxers. Ronnie, in particular, was a formidable and aggressive fighter. In 1951, they were called up for national service in the Royal Fusiliers. This was a pivotal moment that would set them on a path of outright criminality. They despised the discipline and the authority of the army. They went absent without leave repeatedly and assaulted a police officer who tried to arrest them. Their final act of defiance was attacking the prison guard at their military detention center. They were subsequently diagnosed as psychiatrically unfit and discharged in 1954. This failure to conform to any authority outside their own was a defining trait. Upon their return to the East End, they decided to turn professional in boxing. They were managed by their brother Charlie and fought several professional bouts. However, their tempers and their involvement in street fights made a legitimate career unlikely. They were more interested in the power and fear they could command outside the ring. In 1956, they took over a struggling billiard hall in Bethnal Green. The Regal Billiard Hall became their first legitimate business front. More importantly, it became the base for their criminal operations. They used it to plan robberies and to fence stolen goods. It was also here that they began to build their reputation for extreme violence. They were not afraid to use their fists and later weapons to enforce their will. One of their early criminal ventures was protection rackets. They would approach local business owners and offer protection for a weekly fee. Those who refused would find their windows smashed or would be violently assaulted. This created a steady stream of income and established their territorial control. They were also involved in hijacking lorries and armed robberies. Their network of informants and their intimate knowledge of the East End made them effective. What set them apart from other gangsters was their ambition. They did not want to be just local thugs. They wanted to be kings. They began to associate with more established criminals. One such figure was Billy Hill, who was then London's most powerful gangster. Hill saw potential in the violent, ambitious twins. He mentored them and helped them expand their operations. Another key influence was Jack Spot Comer, Hill's main rival. The Krays learned from the gangland wars of the previous generation. They understood that to achieve lasting power, they needed to be both feared and respected. By the late 1950s, they were the undisputed rulers of the East End. Their reputation was built on a foundation of brutal, public violence. One infamous early example was their confrontation with the Watney Street mob. This rival gang challenged their authority in a pub. The Krays responded by storming the pub and viciously attacking the entire group. The message was clear: cross us and you will pay a severe price. This incident cemented their control and their legend. They were no longer just the Kray brothers, they were the Kray twins, a single entity, a brand of terror that would dominate London for a decade. Their rise was a product of time, place, and a ruthless willingness to do what others would not. The stage was now set for their golden years, a period of unprecedented power and notoriety.
The rise to power, the Firm, and the Frighteners. The early 1960s marked the peak of the Kray twins' power and influence. They transformed from local East End enforcers into nationally known figures. Their organization, known as the Firm, became a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The Firm consisted of a core group of trusted associates and a wider network of enforcers. These men were loyal, feared, and well compensated for their services. The Krays operated with a strict code of conduct within their organization. Disloyalty was the ultimate sin, punishable by extreme violence. They cultivated an image of gentlemen gangsters, often photographed in smart suits. This was a deliberate strategy to blend into high society and gain legitimacy. Their base of operations moved from the billiard hall to a series of West End nightclubs. The most famous of these was the Double R Club in Bow, named after Ronnie and Reggie. These clubs were not just money-making ventures, they were stages for their power. They became meeting places for celebrities, politicians, and the criminal underworld. The twins understood the power of publicity and cultivated relationships with the media. They were often photographed with famous stars like Judy Garland and Diana Dors. This created a paradoxical image. They were both glamorous celebrities and brutal thugs. Their criminal activities diversified and expanded during this period. Protection rackets remained a steady source of income. They also moved into long-term fraud, specifically hijacking and armed robbery. Their most lucrative venture, however, was their foray into the West End. They took control of several nightclubs through intimidation and force. One of their key tactics was the use of the Frighteners. This was their term for squads of enforcers sent to intimidate victims. The Frighteners were experts in psychological and physical terror. Their methods ranged from verbal threats to severe beatings. The goal was always the same: to impose the Krays' will without question. A pivotal moment in their rise was the conflict with the Richardson gang. The Richardsons were a South London-based gang led by Charlie and Eddie Richardson. Their rivalry with the Krays was not just about territory, but about style and ambition. The Richardsons were known for their extreme torture methods. The Krays preferred more direct, though equally brutal violence. This rivalry would eventually culminate in a violent public confrontation. In March 1966, the Krays were involved in what became known as the Mr. Smith's incident. They attempted to take over a club in Catford called Mr. Smith's and the Witch Doctor. The club was under the protection of the Richardsons. The Krays arrived with a large group of their men armed with weapons. A fierce and bloody battle ensued inside the club. While no one was killed, many were seriously injured. The police were stunned by the scale and brazenness of the violence. This event showed that the Krays' power now extended far beyond the East End. It also brought them to the serious attention of Scotland Yard's top brass. Another key to their power was their relationship with Lord Boothby. Boothby was a prominent conservative politician and television personality. A photograph emerged of Boothby socializing with Ronnie Kray. The press suggested a homosexual relationship, a criminal offense at the time. The story was suppressed, and Boothby received a substantial out-of-court settlement from a newspaper. This incident demonstrated the Kray's surprising reach into the highest levels of society. It also created an aura of untouchability around them. They seemed to be above the law, protected by powerful friends. Behind the glamorous facade, however, their violence was escalating. Ronnie Kray's mental state was becoming increasingly unstable. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, but refused treatment. His homosexuality, then illegal, was an open secret that added to his volatility. He was prone to sudden, uncontrollable rages. Reggie, while more controlled, was equally capable of extreme violence. The twins complemented each other perfectly. Ronnie was the strategist, the feared and unpredictable one. Reggie was the businessman, the charmer who handled the operations. Together, they were an unstoppable criminal partnership. Their personal lives were deeply intertwined with their criminal ones. Reggie married Frances Shea in 1965, a relationship that would end in tragedy. Frances was the sister of their driver, and Reggie was deeply in love with her. However, she struggled with the pressure of being married to a gangster. Ronnie never married, but had various relationships with men, which was incredibly risky at the time. Their family, particularly their mother Violet, remained a central part of their lives. Violet was fiercely protective of her sons, often turning a blind eye to their activities. The family home in Bethnal Green was a sanctuary from their criminal world. By the mid-1960s, the Krays were at the height of their power. They were wealthy, feared, and seemingly untouchable. They moved in circles that included politicians, lords, and celebrities. Their legend was cemented in the public imagination. However, the very things that made them powerful were also their greatest weaknesses. Their high profile made it impossible for the police to ignore them. Their volatile natures made them unpredictable and dangerous even to their own associates. The foundation of their empire was beginning to crack. The law was closing in, and their world was about to come crashing down. The era of the Kray twins was entering its final dramatic act.
The Reign of Terror. Key Events and Murders. The peak of the Kray twins' power was marked by several key violent events. These acts of brutality were not just criminal acts, they were public statements of their power. They were designed to instill fear and demonstrate that the Krays were above the law. The first of these defining events was the murder of George Cornell. Cornell was a member of the rival Richardson gang. He had publicly insulted Ronnie Kray, calling him a fat poof in a pub. For Ronnie, this was a deep personal insult that could not be ignored. On March 9, 1966, Cornell was drinking at the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. This was considered Kray territory, and his presence was a direct challenge. Ronnie Kray, along with his associate Ian Barry, walked into the pub. The pub fell silent as everyone recognized the notorious gangster. Ronnie walked directly up to Cornell, who was sitting at the bar. He said, "Well, look who's here," and then shot Cornell once in the forehead. The murder was cold, calculated, and executed in front of multiple witnesses. Ronnie and Barry then calmly walked out of the pub. Despite numerous witnesses, no one was willing to testify against the Krays. The police were powerless to make an arrest. The message was clear. The Krays could kill in broad daylight and face no consequences. This murder cemented Ronnie's reputation as a psychotic and unpredictable killer. It also showed the absolute grip of fear they held over their community. The next major event was the murder of Jack the Hat McVitie. McVitie was a small-time criminal and an associate of the firm. He was known for his heavy drinking and volatile behavior. He had failed to carry out a contract killing for which the Krays had paid him. He also had publicly disrespected the twins on several occasions. On October 28, 1967, the Krays lured McVitie to a basement flat in Stoke Newington. They promised him a party and free drinks. When McVitie arrived, Reggie Kray confronted him. He was holding a handgun, but it jammed when he tried to fire. In a frenzy, then Reggie grabbed a kitchen knife. He stabbed McVitie repeatedly in the face and neck, pinning him to the floor. The violence was so extreme that the knife was embedded in McVitie's skull. Ronnie then encouraged Reggie, shouting, "Kill him, Reg!" The murder was a chaotic and bloody mess, unlike the clinical killing of Cornell. It demonstrated Reggie's own capacity for extreme violence. It also showed the twins were becoming increasingly reckless. Their actions were no longer those of calculated businessmen, but of out-of-control thugs. The McVitie murder was a turning point. It horrified many within their own organization. The level of violence was seen as unnecessary and attracting too much police attention. It created a crack in the wall of silence that had protected them. Witnesses were now more afraid of the twins than of the police. The final key event was the torture of a man named Leslie Payne. Payne was not a member of the firm, but their financial advisor. He was known as the brain behind their money-making schemes. He had helped them set up numerous fraudulent companies. However, he decided he wanted to leave their organization. The Krays viewed this as the ultimate betrayal. They kidnapped Payne and took him to a remote farmhouse. They tortured him for hours, trying to extract information. They used pliers, knives, and other tools to inflict pain. Miraculously, Payne managed to escape and went straight to the police. His testimony was a major breakthrough for the investigation. He provided detailed information about their criminal empire. He knew about the murders, the protection rackets, and the fraud. He was the first high-level insider to turn against them. These three key events, the Cornell murder, the McVitie murder, and the Payne torture, painted a clear picture. The Krays were not glamorous gangsters, they were violent psychopaths. Their empire was built on fear, not respect. The police, led by Detective Superintendent Leonard "Nipper" Reed, were building their case. Reed had been tasked with bringing down the Krays once and for all. He knew that a conventional approach would not work. He needed to get inside their organization and turn their own men against them. He focused on the McVitie murder as it had multiple witnesses from within the firm. He began to methodically pressure their associates. He offered deals and protection to those who would testify. The wall of silence was finally beginning to crumble. The twins, however, remained arrogantly confident. They believed their power and influence would protect them. They continued their public lifestyle, attending clubs and social events. They even gave interviews to journalists, boasting of their power. But the net was slowly closing around them. Their reign of terror was entering its final days. The violence that built their empire was now about to destroy it. The stage was set for one of the most famous trials in British criminal history.
The downfall, the trial and imprisonment. The meticulous investigation led by Detective Superintendent Leonard "Nipper" Reed was finally bearing fruit. For years, Reed and his team had been patiently building a case against the Kray twins. They knew that a direct assault would fail. They needed to attack from within. The key was to break the code of silence that protected the twins. Reed focused on the murder of Jack the Hat McVitie. This crime had several witnesses who were members of the firm itself. These men had participated in or witnessed the horrific event. They were the weakest links in the Kray organization.
Reed and his team began a campaign of psychological pressure. They arrested and repeatedly interviewed these associates. They offered deals, protection, and a way out from under the Kray's shadow. It was a slow and painstaking process, requiring immense patience. The breakthrough came when two key associates agreed to testify. Ronald Bender and John Barry, both present at the McVitie murder, turned Queen's evidence. This meant they would testify for the prosecution in exchange for leniency. Their testimony would be the cornerstone of the case. On May 7, 1968, the police moved in. They arrested Reggie and Ronnie Kray, along with their brother Charlie and 15 other members of the firm. The arrests were carried out simultaneously at different locations to prevent any warning. It was a major police operation, the culmination of years of work. The Krays were charged with the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie. They were also charged with conspiracy to murder, armed robbery, and demanding money with menaces. The trial began at the Old Bailey on January 7, 1969. It was one of the most sensational and widely publicized trials in British history. The press dubbed it the trial of the century. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists and spectators. The prosecution was led by Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson. The case presented by the Crown was vast and complex. It outlined a criminal empire built on intimidation, violence, and murder. The star witnesses were Bender and Barry, who provided detailed accounts of the McVitie murder. Their testimony was graphic and chilling. They described Reggie Kray's frenzied attack with a knife. They recounted how Ronnie had encouraged his brother to kill. The defense, led for the twins by John Platts Mills, tried to discredit these witnesses. They painted Bender and Barry as liars and criminals who were saving themselves. They argued there was no forensic evidence directly linking the Krays to the murders. The trial lasted for 39 days. The jury heard from over 100 witnesses. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense and dramatic. On May 7, 1969, the jury returned with their verdict. Reggie and Ronnie Kray were found guilty of the murder of Jack McVitie. Ronnie Kray was also found guilty of the murder of George Cornell. Their older brother Charlie was found guilty of being an accessory to the McVitie murder. All three were also convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and other charges. Mr. Justice Stevenson then passed sentence. He described the twins' crimes as aortic in their wickedness and cynicism. He sentenced Reggie and Ronnie Kray to life imprisonment. He recommended they serve no less than 30 years, a very long tariff for the time. Charlie Kray was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The Kray empire had finally fallen. The twins were sent to different high-security prisons to prevent them from communicating. Reggie was initially sent to Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. Ronnie was sent to Durham prison. Their lives of luxury and power were over. They were now just two more prisoners, subject to the strict rules of the system. The public reaction to their conviction was mixed. In their East End heartland, many still saw them as local heroes. They were viewed as men who had looked after their own community. Others saw the verdict as a long overdue dose of justice. The trial had exposed the brutal reality behind the glamorous myth. The Krays were not romantic figures. They were convicted murderers. Their imprisonment marked an end of an era in British crime. The days of the flamboyant celebrity gangster were over. Organized crime would continue, but it would become more discreet and corporate. The police had won a significant victory. Nipper Reed and his team were hailed for their work. They had proven that no criminal was truly above the law. For the Kray twins, a new and much darker chapter of their lives was beginning. Life in prison was a harsh contrast to their former existence. They were isolated, controlled, and stripped of their power. The downfall was complete.
The legacy, myth, memory, and a cultural phenomenon. The imprisonment of the Kray twins did not end their story. It merely transformed them from active criminals into cultural icons. Their legacy is a complex tapestry of myth, memory, and grim reality. In the years following their conviction, public fascination with them only grew. They became the subject of books, films, and endless newspaper articles. A mythology developed that often overshadowed the facts of their violent crimes. Within the prison system, the twins remained notorious figures. They were treated as high-profile prisoners, often kept in segregation units. Ronnie Kray's mental health continued to deteriorate in prison. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and spent time in psychiatric hospitals. He was eventually transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. Here, he lived until his death, receiving treatment for his condition. Reggie Kray was moved between several high-security prisons. He became a prolific writer and artist while behind bars. He wrote several books about his life and received countless letters from the public. He became a symbol of a bygone era of London. The twins never expressed public remorse for their actions. They maintained their innocence regarding the murders for which they were convicted. They saw themselves as businessmen who had been persecuted by the establishment. This narrative was eagerly consumed by parts of the public. The media played a significant role in shaping their post-trial image. Sensational stories and interviews kept them in the public eye. Their glamorous 1960s image was often emphasized over their violence. The darker aspects of their crimes were sometimes softened or forgotten. Their family remained fiercely loyal throughout their imprisonment. Their mother Violet visited them regularly until her death in 1982. Her passing was a devastating blow to both brothers. Their brother Charlie was released from prison but was later convicted on drug charges. He died in 2000, having never fully escaped the shadow of his brothers. The twins themselves began to die, one by one. Ronnie Kray died of a heart attack on March 17, 1995, at the age of 61. He died in Broadmoor Hospital, still a prisoner. His funeral was a massive East End spectacle, attended by thousands. It was a final display of the enduring Kray legend. Reggie Kray was released from prison on compassionate grounds in August 2000. He was suffering from inoperable bladder cancer and had only weeks to live. His release sparked a media frenzy and public debate. He died on October 1, 2000, just weeks after his release. His funeral mirrored his brother's, a grand affair through the streets of the East End. With their deaths, the final chapter of their lives closed. But their story was far from over. The cultural industries surrounding the Krays continued to flourish. Numerous films have been made about their lives. The most famous is the 1990 film The Krays, starring Martin and Gary Kemp. More recently, the 2015 film Legend featured Tom Hardy playing both twins. These films contribute to the ongoing mythologizing of their story. Their image has been used in fashion, music, and art. Their faces appear on T-shirts, and their names are referenced in song lyrics. They have become a shorthand for a certain type of British coolness and rebellion. This commercial exploitation often ignores the victims of their violence.
The families of George Cornell and Jack McVitie have repeatedly spoken out. They have expressed pain at seeing their loved ones' killers celebrated. They argued that the Krays were not heroes, but murderers. This tension between myth and reality is at the heart of the Kray legacy. In the East End, opinions about them remain divided. Some older residents remember them as community figures who kept order. They recall a time when the streets were safer and the Krays punished petty criminals. This nostalgic view overlooks the fear and violence they instilled. Younger generations often see them as fictional characters from films. The brutal reality feels distant and unreal. Academic studies have analyzed the Kray phenomenon. Sociologists examine why society remains fascinated by violent criminals. Historians place them in the context of post-war Britain. Their story reflects the social changes and anxieties of their time. The legal system also learned from the Kray case. The methods used by Nipper Read became a blueprint for fighting organized crime. The importance of witness protection was firmly established. The case showed that patience and intelligence gathering could defeat powerful criminals. Today, the physical landscape of their London has largely disappeared. The old East End pubs and streets have been redeveloped. But the memory of the Krays persists. Tourists can still take guided walks of Kray London. Pubs where they drank trade on their connection. Their legacy is a cautionary tale about the allure of crime and power. It shows how violence can be sanitized and glamorized over time. It reminds us that behind the myth were real people who caused real suffering. The story of the Kray twins continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. It is a story that says as much about society as it does about the twins themselves. Our enduring interest in them reflects our own complex relationship with crime, celebrity, and power.